Yo, what is up, YouTube? Today we are gonna talk about some serious things going on right now. What are kamikaze drones and the future of modern warfare? Let's get into it. So, Iran, as you can see right here, Iran has sent these mini stealth plane drones, basically bombs, flying little planes, missiles that are just flying bombs. Kamikaze drones is what they're calling them. And honestly, what are kamikaze drones? Now, I have heard of the term kamikaze pilot, and that is referring to the Japanese pilots during World War II that would just dive bomb American battleships, trying to destroy American battleships, also, killing themselves. But, technology has gotten so advanced that we don't have to have pilots anymore. It's just these operated drones that are just turning themselves into missiles. And the public of, the is going to suffer, basically. But I Googled, or I looked up, what are kamikaze drones. I just wanted to show you this picture first to start off with what they look like, because here's what they look like. I mean, this is what Iran has sent to Russia. It's terrifying. But this is the future of modern warfare. But here is what they originally were called. They were not originally called kamikaze drones. They were called loitering munition. So loitering munition, also known as a suicide drone or kamikaze drone or exploding drone, is a kind of aerial weapon with a built-in munition warhead, which can loiter, wait passively around the target area until a target is located. It then attacks the target by crashing into it. Loitering munitions enable faster reaction times against hidden targets that emerge for short periods, without placing high-value platforms near the target area, and also allow more selective targeting as the attack can be changed mid-flight or aborted. And this is right off the Wikipedia front page. Loitering munitions fit in the niche between cruise missiles and unmanned combat aerial vehicles, or combat drones. So what's the difference between a combat drone and a kamikaze drone? Sharing characteristics with both drones. They differ from cruise missiles in that they are designed to loiter for a relatively long time around the target area, just hovering like a vulture. And from UACVs, in that a loitering munition is intended to be expended in an attack and has a built-in warhead. As such, they can also be considered a non-traditional ranged weapon. Loitering weapons first emerged in the 1980s for use in the suppression of enemy air defenses role against surface-to-air missiles, and were deployed in that role with a number of military forces in the 1990s. Starting in the 2000s, loitering weapons were developed for additional roles ranging from relatively long-range strikes and fire support down to tactical, very short-range battlefield systems that fit in a backpack. Well, this is terrifying. The future of modern America, not just American warfare, but world warfare. That these devastating drones can be flown anywhere, sent in, programmed in with a GPS, right there, fly right to your doorstep. Ethical and international humanitarian law concerns. Loitering munitions that are capable of making autonomous attack decisions raise moral, ethical, and international humanitarian law concerns because a human being is not involved in making the actual decision to attack and potentially kill humans, as is the case with fire and forget missiles in common use since the 1960s. Whereas some guided munitions may lock on after launch or may be sensor fused, their flight time is typically limited, and a human launches them at an area where enemy activity is strongly suspected. As is the case with modern fire and forget missiles and airstrike planning, an autonomous loitering munition, on the other hand, may be launched at an area where enemy activity is only probable and loiter searching autonomously for targets for potentially hours following the initial launch decision. Though it may be able to request final authorization for an attack from a human, the IAI Harpy are frequently cited in relevant literature as they set a precedent for an aerial system, though not necessarily a precedent when comparing to a modern naval mine in terms of length and quality of autonomous function in relation to a cruise missile, for example. So we're on the verge of something different here. And this was written before that these new kamikaze drones were invented, that these, especially these new ones from Iran. These bad boys right here. So I looked this up. This is the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine during Russia's invasion from February 24th to the end of July, just a few days ago. So far that there's been 9,369 killed, Ukraine's killed, and 16,646 injured. I mean, this is very severe. And now with these new drones from Iran, Russia's stepping it up. And it's terrifying. And my heart goes out for the Ukrainians. And it's bringing some military, and I'm going to get into this later, but the United States military is partially responsible and partially to blame for what's going on over in Europe right now. The U.S. and NATO helped trigger the Ukraine war. It's not siding with Putin to admit it. Vladimir Putin's decisions to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine is a monstrous act of aggression that has plunged the world into a perilous situation. By any reasonable standard, his move was an over-the-top response to any Ukrainian or NATO provocations. And it's interesting right now with NATO because Ukraine was trying to quickly get into NATO. And if that would have been the case, then all of NATO would have had to have gone to war against Russia. But right now, Ukraine's still technically not a part of Ukraine, and NATO, I believe, blocked that on purpose because they don't want to, no one wants to all out go to war against Russia. I mean, this is really an odd, scary time. Especially since Russia apparently has been, hanging out with China. And then now Putin's going to hang out with his brothers down in Africa. Putin's getting support, whether Americans want to admit it or not. And sadly, Russia hasn't even really started amped up against Ukraine. I mean, they haven't even sent in troops yet. It's just now with these drones. The conclusion is different from saying that there were no provocations, as far too many policymakers and pundits in the West are doing now. Russian leaders and several Western policy experts were warning more than 2 decades ago that NATO expansion would turn out badly, ending in a new Cold War with Russia at best, and a hot one at worst. Obviously, they were not echoing Putin or anyone else. George Kennan, the intellectual architect of America's containment policy during the Cold War, perceptively warned in a May 2nd, 1998 New York Times interview what NATO's move eastward would set in motion. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War, he stated. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake that these countries who were liberated from Soviet Russia, that basically were part of Russia, the part of the Soviet Union, were now, like Ukraine, applying for a membership to NATO. Imagine if Florida became its own country. Kennan was speaking of the first round of enlargement that brought into the alliance Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Later rounds, which added the Baltic republics and other European countries, were considerably more abrasive, and Washington's subsequent attempt to make Ukraine and Georgia members was contemptuous of Russia's core security interests. Moscow's complaints and warnings were becoming increasingly sharp as well. Yet U.S. and European officials blew through one red light after another. George W. Bush began to treat Georgia and Ukraine as valued U.S. political and military allies. And this is, the United States president, before we get off bashing George Bush here, or Trump or Biden, the thing is that the president of the United States is just a temporary employee. That the military has been in charge for decades. Plans have had this planned out for decades. And the smartest people on the planet work for the United States military. And that this has been planned and thought out for years. You think this was George Bush's idea? No, it wasn't. George W. Bush began to treat Georgia and Ukraine as valued U.S. political and military allies. And in 2008, he pressed NATO to admit Ukraine and Georgia as members. French and German wariness delayed that endeavor. Yeah, because they're a lot closer to home to Russia than we are. But the NATO summit communique affirmed that both countries would eventually achieve that status. In his 2014 memoir, Duty, Robert M. Gates, who served as Secretary of Defense in both Bush's administration and Barack Obama's, conceded that trying to bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO was truly overreaching. That initiative, he concluded, was a case of recklessly ignoring what the Russians considered their own vital national interests. So imagine Florida, New York, Vermont, whatever, pick your favorite state, and then say that they want to be their own state, and then Canada forcing the United States to honor that. And in a perfect world, we would. But the United States military knew that Russia wasn't going to like that, because they wouldn't have liked it. But they pushed for it anyway. And this has been over a span of, since Reagan, one of the best military political puppets ever. And then we've had a lot of puppets since Reagan. And now our military is getting what it wants, the military-industrial complex. Moscow began to push back. Putin exploited a foolish provocation by Georgia's pro-Western government to launch a military offensive that penetrated deeply into the country. Upon its victory, Russia permanently detached two secessionist-minded Georgian regions and put them under permanent Russian control, which is what eventually they're going to do to Ukraine. The Kremlin's decisive action should have alerted even slow-learning U.S. leaders that the days of Russian officials merely issuing verbal protest against the West's steady encroachment into Russia's security sphere were over. Amazingly, though, the Obama administration still sought to turn Ukraine into a NATO and political and military asset. And this is back in 2013, 2014. And the powers that be refused, still then, 10 years ago, to get Ukraine into NATO. They knew that this was going to happen, Putin's war. This has been all set up for years, in the making. The Ukraine episode proved to be an intolerable provocation to neighboring Russia. Putin responded by annexing the strategic Crimea Peninsula and the United States and its NATO partners, then imposed economic sanctions on Russia. The new Cold War was on in earnest. Yet Washington refused to back off. Instead, the Trump and Biden administrations poured weapons into Ukraine, approved joint military exercises between the U.S. and Ukrainian forces, and even prodded the allies to include Ukraine in NATO war games. And look, I am not in favor of Russia. I'm condemning Russia and Putin. But the people need to realize that the United States military provoked this, inadvertently caused this war for the military industrial complex. And we make one of the only things that we make in America today are drones and weapons of mass destruction. So for the powers that be, the military establishment, they're going to be making a lot of money. And who's to blame? The people, us. And this stretches across both parties, Democrat, Republicans. They both have skin in the game and stocks in these companies. Some of them own the companies. In late 2021, it became clear that the Kremlin's restraint had run dry, that Moscow issued demands for security guarantees, including a drawdown of military forces already deployed in NATO's eastern members. With respect to Ukraine, the demand was very clear and uncompromising. Not only would Kiev never receive a membership invitation, but NATO weapons and troops would never be deployed on Ukrainian soil. Officially. That's officially. But kind of like the Nicaragua Contras, America's going to find the way to get those weapons in. And did the American people get to vote on this? When the West failed to provide those guarantees, Putin launched his devastating full-scale war. Moscow's cruel overreaction deserves emphatic condemnation. However, the culpability of the United States and its NATO allies also is sizable. Okay, so it's saying the same thing I was saying. This article's agreeing with me. Moving an alliance that one great power dominates to the border of another major power is inherently destabilizing and provocative. Those people who are familiar with even the basics of international relations should grasp that point. It was inexcusable that so many U.S. and NATO leaders apparently did not do so. One can readily imagine how Americans would react if Russia, China, India, or another peer competitor admitted countries from Central America and the Caribbean to a security alliance that it led, and then sought to add Canada as an official or de facto military ally. It is highly probable that the United States would have responded by going to war years ago. Yet even though Ukraine has an importance to Russia comparable to Canada's importance to the United States, our leaders expected Moscow to respond passively to the growing encroachment. They have been proven disastrously wrong, and thanks to their ineptitude, the world is now a far more dangerous place. This was written by Ted Gallen Carpenter, former senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Not only that, but let's also move on to something else that the media just briefly talked about, and that's Putin going to rally allies in Africa. African leaders leave Russia summit without grain deal or path to peace in Ukraine. Nairobi, Kenya. African leaders are leaving 2 days of meetings with Russian President Vladimir Putin with little to show for their request to resume a deal that kept grain flowing from Ukraine and to find a path to end the war there. Putin, in a press conference late Saturday, following the Russia-African summit, said Russia's termination of the grain deal earlier this month caused a rise in grain prices that benefits Russian companies. He added that Moscow would share some of those revenues with the poorest nations. That commitment, with no details, follows Putin's promise to start shipping 25,000 to 50,000 tons of grain for free to each of 6 African nations in the next 3 to 4 months, an amount dwarfed by the 725,000 tons shipped by the UN World Food Program to several hungry countries, African and otherwise, under the grain deal. Russia plans to send the free grain to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Eritrea, and Central African Republic. So that's minuscule compared to what the UN is sending. But still, Putin has some pull over there. Fewer than 20 of Africa's 54 heads of state or government attended the Russia summit, while 43 attended the previous gathering in 2019, reflecting concerns over Russia's invasion of Ukraine, even as Moscow seeks more allies on the African continent of 1.3 billion people. And this is just another tug of war that's going on in Africa that the people need to educate themselves on and to pay attention to what's going on. Putin praised Africa as a rising center of power in the world, while the Kremlin blamed outrageous Western pressures for discouraging some African countries from showing up. The presidents of Egypt and South Africa were among the most outspoken on the need to resume the grain deal. We would like the Black Sea Initiative to be implemented and that the Black Sea should be open, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said. We are not here to plead for donations for the African continent. Putin also said Russia would analyze African leaders' peace proposal for Ukraine, whose details have not been publicly shared. But the Russian leader asked, "Why do you ask us to pause fire? Why can't pause fire? We can't pause fire while we're being attacked." The next significant step in peace efforts instead appears to be a Ukrainian organized peace summit hosted by Saudi Arabia in August, and Russia is not invited. Africa's nations makes up the largest voting bloc at the United Nations and have been more divided than any other region on General Assembly resolutions criticizing Russia's actions in Ukraine. Delegations at the summit in St. Petersburg roamed exhibits of weapons, a reminder of Russia's role as the top arms supplier to the African continent. Putin, in his remarks on Saturday, also downplayed his absence from the BRICS Economic Summit in South Africa next month amid a controversy over an arrest warrant issued against him by the International Criminal Court. His presence there, Putin said, is not more important than my presence here in Russia. So Africa's torn. There's another article here about it. Isolated by the West, Putin hosted a summit for leaders from Africa in St. Petersburg. At a time of increasing isolation for Russian President Vladimir Putin on the world stage, he just concluded a summit with leaders from Africa. Well, the war in Ukraine has united the West in condemnation of Russia and support for Ukraine. the position of much of the rest of the world appears less certain. That was in evidence in St. Petersburg over the past couple of days, where President Vladimir Putin hosted leaders from Africa for the summit. NPR's Charles Maines joins us now from Moscow. Thanks for being with us, Charles. Let's see here. Maines says, well, Russia has been focusing increasingly on Africa in recent years, almost trying to reassert influence it once had under the Soviet Union. Sometimes it can feel like a replay of the big power politics of the Cold War, and that trend has really picked up even more as Russia has faced Western condemnation over its actions in Ukraine. So events like this one, which is billed as the Russia-African Summit, allow Moscow to show that it is not isolated as the West claims, and that Russia still has plenty of friends in the rest of the world. And it's why we saw President Vladimir Putin really fed his audience. Putin hosted in his home city, the beautiful St. Petersburg, and he made a pitch, he does often these days, that power had shifted away from the U.S. and Europe to what he calls a multipolar world, one where not only Russia but Africa will play a major role whether the West likes it or not. Putin, speaking Friday, tells the audience that in front of our very eyes, that Africa is growing into a major political and economic power, and the rest of the world will have to accept what he calls that objective reality. The summit takes place just as Russia has decided not to renew the UN-backed grain deal that delivered a lot of food to Africa. Did Putin try to overcome doubts about that? Putin clearly came in looking to appease critics of Russia's exit from the grain deal. On day one of the summit, he announced Russia expected a record harvest with more than enough reserves to make up for lost Ukrainian exports to the African continent. Moreover, he said Russia would provide tens of thousands of tons of grain for free to several African countries. The next day, it was canceling some $23 billion in debt to the African nations. So Putin's buttering them up. I mean, not only is he giving them free food, but he's also wiping away their debt. And yet this Russian Largesi kind of bumps up against the economic reality. The West provides far more trade and aid to Africa. Also left unsaid here is that Russia's subsequent blockade and nearly daily bombing of Ukrainian grain facilities has led to a spike in food prices globally. And for that reason, perhaps it was unsurprising to see several of the African guests press Putin, as they have in the past, to find a negotiated settlement to end the war. What other ways is Russia trying to draw allies from Africa? Earlier, we talked about the Cold War with the U.S. and the Soviet Union competing in Africa with their competing political ideologies, and today there's kind of a new twist on that. Putin seeks to find common cause with potential allies over what Russia calls traditional family values. In other words, conservatism. And they've really grafted that on really as an added front to this wider war with the West. So, for example, we saw Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill on a stage in St. Petersburg denouncing same-sex marriage as hedonistic and approved by the West, but not in Russia, and he implied in large parts of Africa. Meanwhile, military aid and weapons also hold their lure. One of the more popular stands at the summit involved new generation weapons. Let's not forget the Soviet-made Kalashnikov machine gun and the continent's weapon of choice. There were also indications that the leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was in St. Petersburg to meet with some African delegates on the sidelines. If true, it suggests that the Kremlin has, in some fashion, plans to retain Wagner services to countries in Africa as Moscow seeks to develop and deepen ties in the continent. And this is an NPR transcript. Here's another article from the New Yorker. Is America to blame for Russia's war in Ukraine? To explain a bad actor's behavior is not to justify it. In mundane contexts, few people struggle to understand this point. For example, if an alcoholic relative comes over for Thanksgiving dinner and behaves in a charming, avuncular manner until he finishes off his eighth beer, at which point he subjects his prepubescent nephew to a pornographic account of his backpacking trip through Europe circa 1996, says, "I'm thankful for my ex-wife's heart attack," and then cries into his mashed potatoes while moaning that he's incapable of love. Most would say that this relative's inebriation explains his conduct, even as if it does not justify it. Had Uncle Walter not been drinking, he would not have ruined Thanksgiving. But the fact that Walter was drinking did not make it okay for him to spoil the holiday. So we're going to compare that to Russia. Now let's say that his Uncle Walter did not bring beer to the festivities himself, but merely encountered beer that Aunt Rachel had purchased. In that circumstance, we might recognize Rachel's decision to bring beer caused Thanksgiving to be ruined. We're going to compare Rachel to America here. Even though Aunt Rachel is not morally culpable for that sad outcome, thus, even though Walter's family members are not at fault for this conduct, they may nevertheless decide that it would be wise for them to alter their own behavior to preempt such uncomfortable scenes in the future by, say, establishing a no alcohol at Thanksgiving rule. This mode of reasoning is not terribly controversial when applied to Codicean matters. When one applies it to foreign affairs, however, it tends to raise hackles. In the wake of 9/11, those who argued that Osama bin Laden's stated motivations for the attacks may have been genuine, and thus that the American military's interventions in the Middle East had played a casual role in the atrocity, were routinely denounced for justifying bin Laden's violence and or blaming America for its own national tragedy. This tendency to confuse explanation and justification has cropped again up in contemporary debates over the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Some commentators argue that American foreign policy helped to bring about this crisis. Their argument goes roughly like this. Vladimir Putin's destructive actions are a predictable consequence of America's decisions to expand NATO eastward and encourage Ukraine to align with the European Union instead of Russia. For decades, the Kremlin made it clear to the West that it considered NATO expansion and a westernized Ukraine antithetical to Russia's core security interests. Nevertheless, the U.S. encouraged Ukraine to integrate with Europe and refused to rule out its admission into NATO's military alliance. America did this knowing, one, that there was a high risk that Putin would defend his conception of Russia's interest in Ukraine militarily, that the U.S. was not willing to expend American lives or risk nuclear war in the defense of Ukrainian sovereignty, and three, that Ukraine would be incapable of militarily defeating a Russian invasion without the aid of a foreign army. Given this knowledge, the argument continues America's support for Ukraine's assertions of dependence from Russia. In fact, a betrayal. The epitomal path for maximizing Ukrainians' autonomy in warfare, given the constraints imposed by Russia's strength and the West's unwillingness to fight, was for Ukraine to forswear NATO membership and pledge neutrality between Russia and Europe. And they're right there in the buffer zone. The alternative course was bound to lead to Ukraine into catastrophe. As the realist international relations scholar John Mearsheimer put the point in 2015, what's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. Today, this analysis is largely confined to anti-establishment foreign policy scholars and left-wing dissidents. But as Peter Bernard notes, its basic premises were once common sense among America's national security elite. George Kennan, the living legend who had fathered America's policy of containment against the Soviet Union, called NATO expansion a strategic blunder of potentially epic proportions. Thomas Friedman, America's most prominent foreign policy columnist, declared it most ill-conceived project of the post-Cold War era. In 2014, Henry Kissinger, the personification of the American foreign policy establishment, argued, the West must understand that to Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country. If Ukraine is to survive and thrive, Henry Kissinger insisted, it must not be either side's outpost against the other. It should function as a bridge between them. Like I said, is a buffer. Instead of joining NATO, Ukraine should pursue a posture comparable to that of Finland, in which it cooperates with the West in most fields, but carefully avoids institutional hostility towards Russia. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who in his time as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor was known as a Cold War hawk, nonetheless embraced Finland model as well, that Ukraine, he insisted, could have no participation in any military alliance viewed by Moscow as directed at itself. I mean, America has been filling Ukraine with all this hope and dreams, and Russia is bringing them back down to reality. And this has been years in the making. One can raise plenty of objections to this analysis. For one thing, much of it rests on the presumption that Putin would have acquiesced to a genuinely neutral Ukraine as opposed to one that marched in lockstep with Russia's interest. Given that Putin declared Ukraine an inalienable part of Russia's spiritual space when justifying his invasions, it is not obvious that this is the case. Regardless, to argue that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a predictable response to American policy choices is not to say that it was justified response to those choices. Too often in recent days, people trying to make the former argument have been denounced for making the latter one. That said, slippage between explanation and justification is actually happening on both sides of the debate over Putin's motives. A small minority of the left in the U.S. is so fixated on its attempt for American imperialism that it suggests that Russia is justified in seeing a Western-aligned Ukraine as an affront to their security. I'm sorry. A small minority of the left in the U.S. is so fixated on its contempt for American imperialism that it suggests that Russia is justified in seeing a Western-aligned Ukraine as an affront to their security. From this point of view, American support for Ukraine's integration with Europe was not merely reckless but immoral. Supporting Ukraine's assertion of independence from Moscow was an imperial act of aggression against Russia, as though Putin were entitled to veto power over Ukrainian foreign policy as a matter of right. Realists like John Mearsheimer, meanwhile, often speak as though there is no difference between a great power's predictable actions and its justified ones. Indeed, in Mearsheimer's telling, a fully independent Ukraine is not just a fundamental threat to Russian security in Putin's mind, but an actual fact. This is despite the fact that Moscow's vast nuclear weapons arsenal renders a Western incursion into Russia unthinkable. After all, as recent events have made clear, the Western powers are so rightly terrified by the prospect of a nuclear war with Russia that they are not even willing to directly combat the Russian army when it launches a war of aggression. Mearsheimer's equation of explanation and justification comes to the fore in his recent interview with the New Yorker's Isaac Choetner. Mearsheimer tells Choetner that the United States engineered the conflict with Russia by encouraging Ukraine to join NATO and the EU, turning Ukraine into a pro-American liberal democracy. Choetner suggests that Ukraine turned itself into a liberal democracy and that Russia does not have the right to tell Ukraine what kind of government it can have or what its foreign policy must be. Mearsheimer counters that as a great power, Russia does have that right. Russia is acting exactly as we, the U.S. government, would in their position. That leads to the following exchange. Mearsheimer's words are in plain text. Choetner's are in bold. Saying that America will not allow countries in the Western Hemisphere, most of them democracies, to decide what kind of foreign policy they have, you can say that's good or bad, but that is imperialism, right? We're essentially saying that we have some sort of say over how democratic countries run their business. We do have that say, and in fact, we overthrow democratically elected leaders in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War because we are unhappy with their policies. This is the way great powers behave. Sadly. Of course we did. But I'm wondering if we should be behaving that way. When we're thinking about foreign policies, should we be thinking about trying to recreate a world neither the U.S. nor Russia is behaving that way? Should we be thinking about trying to create a world where neither Russia nor the U.S. is behaving that way? That's not the way the world works. When you try to create a world that looks like that, you end up with the disastrous policies that the United States pursued during the unipolar moment. We went around the world trying to create liberal democracies. Our main focus, of course, was in the greater Middle East, and you know how well that worked out. Not very well. At no point in the interview does Mearsheimer articulate the normative content of his worldview, a disastrous policy, implicitly, one that erodes the global power of the United States. Why? Precisely. We as human beings should care about whether the United States is more powerful than China, given that, in Mearsheimer's account, both nations will rule like tyrants over the world's weaker nations if given the chance is never explained. As Choitner observes, Mearsheimer does occasionally voice moral objections to U.S. foreign policy. He has lamented America's complicity in the crimes perpetuated against the Palestinians. The object of much of his realist analysis of international relations is to help America avert needless wars. Yet he nevertheless insists on naturalizing the aggression of powerful states as though America's decision to overthrow the Arbenz government was tantamount to a chemical reaction rather than the contingent crime perpetuated by well-connected friends of the United Fruit Company. I'm going to skip down here a little bit. Similarly, the policies that would maximize Russia's national security are not necessarily the same as those that would maximize Putin regime's political stability. And in any case, the Russian president is not necessarily capable of accurately identifying either. It is bizarre to suggest that Russia's actions in Ukraine were dictated by its objective security interest by virtually any measure. Putin's invasion has already undermined those interests. The anarchic nature of international relations may give Russia an incentive to bully Ukraine. Yet, as this week's sanctions have made clear, Russia also had plenty of incentive to forswear a war of conquest. As of February 15th of this year, Mearsheimer himself deemed that incentive so overwhelming as to prevent a rational actor like Putin from invading Ukraine has justified complaints about NATO expansion notwithstanding. Putin had no intention of invading Ukraine, Mearsheimer assured as a group of students at King's College, in part because if he invades Ukraine, we have made it clear in the West that we will go to great lengths to cripple the Russian economy. The rulers of powerful nations have agency, as Mearsheimer has long ironically lamented. America's leaders routinely adopt policies that undermine their own nation's standing in great power competition. They could just as easily decide that their nation's best interest will be served by great power cooperation. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a free choice, and whatever role U.S. policy played in determining Putin's decision, it did not force his hand. Critics of NATO expansion would be wise to stipulate this point, since doing otherwise only renders their casual analysis easier to stigmatize. I mean, just look at these drones that Iran sent in to Russia, kind of a present. Iran made drones here on display in a ceremony marking to provide to the nation's army. And not only this what's going on, Ukraine and Russia, but also Russia's hooking up with China. And today, radar located Russian and Chinese battleships off the coast of Alaska. China and Russia patrolled near Alaska. The U.S. Navy sent destroyers to the coast of Alaska last week after 11 Russian and Chinese warships were spotted patrolling nearby international waters. Senator Dan Sullivan, a Republican from Alaska, called the size of the Chinese and Russian joint operation unprecedented, and said the U.S. deployed 4 Navy destroyer ships near the Aleutian Islands in response. The destroyers were the USS John McCain, the USS Benfold, USS John Finn, and USS Chung Hoon. The U.S. aircraft were also in the area throughout the combined exercise, which the U.S. had been tracking since it began in July. According to U.S. officials, U.S. Coast Guard ships are also always in the area. Look how close Alaska is to Russia. This map really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? U.S. Northern Command said the Chinese and Russian patrol remained in international waters and wasn't considered a threat. But the show of force is a reminder of the cooperation between the Chinese and Russian militaries and of how close the countries are to Alaska. A similar joint exercise took place last September when the U.S. Coast Guard encountered 7 Chinese and Russian ships near Alaska, all in a single formation. China and Russia have increased their ties amid tensions with the U.S. over Taiwan and Ukraine, making situations like this more alarming. In a statement, the Chinese embassy said the patrol was part of an annual cooperation plan and has nothing to do with the current international and regional situations. Well, that's BS. It absolutely does. Oh, the Chinese embassy. Touching back on the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine during Russia's invasion, verified. You know, this is not that popular today, but you know, I just want to say a prayer, not, you know, for everyone around the world, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia too, and for China, and all the families involved, and to find peace in your heart to stop this war. That, you know, we all live in this small blueberry called Earth. You know, I read an article about one of the astronauts, American astronauts who, you know, only a handful of men were able to go to the moon. And as he was walking on the moon, he looks up at the Earth, and it was a crescent Earth. And let me look that up. So here we are, the moon, and here's the Earth. You know, it seems so far away, but that's us. You know? And we're all in this small, tiny blueberry that really, we all live in the same house. We all live in the same house, and if one room catches on fire, then it's not going to be long before the whole house catches on fire. And over what? And, I pray for peace, and that we all need each other, and that we need to get along and be cordial and polite. And there's plenty of resources to go along, to be spread around, and that this is needless, that we can do better. We have to do better. We can't. We haven't had a major war since World War II. And we don't ever need to have another one like that ever again. This is we're all in this together. Here's the one I'm talking about. Here's the picture that I'm talking about. That's us. We're all in this together. All of this drama and conflict and murder and war and fighting, infighting, that we're all right there in that blueberry, spinning around at 17,000 miles per hour. But we all live in the same house, and we got to take care of the house, or otherwise it's going to burn down with us in it. And my heart goes out to everyone involved and everyone affected by this war. And God bless you. And I send you some peace and hope for a better day, for a better tomorrow. And I send you love and peace. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you very much, YouTube. This is Kyle Graves Live. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if I'm taking requests at this point. I'm pretty new to the game here, doing live streaming, but I do a lot of research and read a lot of articles on my own, so I figured might as well turn the camera on because it's what I love and it's my passion. And I invite you to come along for the journey with me, because I love it. I love doing this. And if you have any ideas or articles you would like for me to read and discuss and to study, to write an article about or do a video blog on, please email me at kjg0623@gmail.com. Also, you can leave a message there at the comments of Kyle Graves Live. But thank you so much. Peace.